Foreword of Superwomen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Betty B. Superwomen by Albert Payson Terhune. Foreword. Find the woman. You will discover her in almost every generation, in almost every country, in almost every big city. The Superwoman. She is not the typical adventuress. She is not a genius. The reason for her strange power is occult. When psycho-vivisectionists have thought they had segregated the cause, the formula, what you will, in one particular superwoman or group of superwomen, straightway some new member of the clan has arisen who wields equal power with their notable sisters, but who has none of the traits that made them irresistible. And the seekers of formulas are again at sea. What makes the superwoman? Is it beauty? Cleopatra and Rachel were homely. Is it daintiness? Marguerite de Valois washed her hands but twice a week. Is it wit? Pompadour and La Valliere were avowedly stupid in conversation. Is it youth? Diane de Poitiers and Ninon de l'Enclos were wildly adored at 60. Is it the subtle quality of femininity? George Sand, who numbered her admirers by the score, poor Chopin in their foremost rank, was not only ugly but disgustingly mannish. So was Semiramis. The nameless charm is found almost as often in the masculine advanced woman as in the ultra-feminine damsel. Here are stories of superwomen who conquered at will. Some of them smashed thrones, some were content with wholesale heart-smashing. Wherein lay their secret? Or rather, their secrets? For seldom did two of them follow the same plan of campaign. Albert Payson Terhune, Sunnybank, Pompton Lakes, New Jersey, 1916. End of foreword.
Chapter 1 of Superwomen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Superwomen by Albert Payson Terhune. Chapter 1. Lola Montez, the dancer who kicked over a throne. Her Majesty's Theatre in London, one night in 1843, was jammed from pit to roof. Lumley, the astute manager, had whispered that he had a find. His whisper had been judiciously pitched in a key that enabled it to penetrate St. James Street clubs, Park Lane boudoirs, even city counting rooms. The managerial whisper had been augmented by a private view, to which many journalists and a few influential men about town had been bidden. These lucky guests had shifted the pitch from whispered to paean by word of mouth, and by ardent quill the song of praise had spread. One of the latter forms of tribute had run much in this rural newspaper form. A brilliant divertissement is promised by Mr. Lumley for the forthcoming performance of The Tarantula at Her Majesty's. Thursday evening will mark the British debut of the mysterious and bewitchingly beautiful Castilian dancer Lola Montez. Through the delicate veins of this lovely daughter of dreamy Andalusia sparkles the sang azur, which is the birthright of the Hidalgo families alone. In her is the embodiment not alone the haughty lineage of centuries of noble ancestry, but all the fire and mystic charm that are the precious heritage of the Southland. At a private view yesterday, at which your correspondent had the honor to be an invited guest, this peerless priestess of Terpsichore, and so on for well nigh a column of adjective-starred panegyric, which waxed more impassioned as the dictionary supply of unrepeated superlatives waned. This was before the day of the recognized press agent. Folk had a way of believing what they read. Hence the gratifyingly packed theatre to witness the mysterious Spaniard's debut. Royalty itself, surrounded by tired gentlemen in waiting who wanted to sit down and could not, occupied one stage box. In the front of another lolled Lord Ranelagh, arbiter of London fashion and accepted authority on all matters of taste, whether in dress, dancers, or duels. Ranelagh recently came back from a tour of the East, divided with royalty the reverent attention of the stalls. The pit whistled and clapped in merry impatience for the appearance of the danseuse. The West End section of the house waited in equal, if more subdued, eagerness, and prepared to follow every possible expression of Ranelagh's large-toothed, side-whiskered visage as a signal for its own approval or censure of the much-advertised Lola's performance. The first scene of the opera passed almost unnoticed. Then the stage was cleared, and a tense hush gripped the house. A fanfare of cornets, and from the wings a supple dark girl bounded. A whirlwind of welcome from pit and gallery greeted her. She struck a sensuous pose in the stage's exact center. The cornetists laid aside their instruments. Guitars and mandolins set up a throbby string overture. Lola drew a deep breath, flashed a vivid Spanish smile on the audience at large, and took the first languid step of her dance. Then it was that the dutiful signal-seekers cast overt looks once more at Lord Ranelagh. That ordinarily stolid nobleman was leaning far forward in his stage-box, mouth and eyes wide, staring with incredulous amaze at the posturing Andalusian. Before her first step was complete, Ranelagh's astonishment burst the shackles of silence. "Gad!" he roared, his excited voice smashing through the soft music and penetrating to every cranny. "Gad! It's little Betty James!" He broke into a Homeric guffaw. A toady who sat beside him hissed sharply. The hiss and the guffaw were cues quite strong enough for the rest of the house. A sizzling, swishing chorus of hisses went up from the stalls, was caught by the pit, and tossed aloft in swelling crescendo to the gallery, where it was intensified to treble volume. Lola's artistically made-up face had gone white under its rouge and pearl powder at Ranelagh's shout. Now it flamed crimson. The girl danced on. She was gallant, a thoroughbred to the core, even though she chanced to be a thoroughbred Irish instead of a thoroughbred Spanish, and she would not be hissed from the stage. But now boos mingled with the hisses, and Ranelagh's immoderate laughter was caught up by scores of people who did not in the least know at what they were laughing. The storm was too heavy to weather. Lumley growled an order. Down swooped the curtain, leaving the crowd booing on one side of it and Lola raging on the other. Which ended the one and only English theatrical experience of Lola Montez, the dreamy Andalusian dancer from County Limerick, Ireland. That night at Almack's, Lord Ranelagh told a somewhat lengthy story whose details he had picked up in the East, which was repeated with interesting variations next day on Rotten Row, a dozen clubs, in 100 drawing-rooms. There is the gist of the tale. Some quarter-century before the night of Lola's London premiere and derniere, an Irish girl, Eliza Oliver by name, had caught the errant fancy of a great man. The man chanced to be Lord Byron, at that time loafing about the continent and trying, outwardly at least, to live up to the mental image of himself that was just then enshrined in the hearts of several thousand demure English schoolmaids. Byron soon tired of Miss Oliver. It is doubtful whether he ever saw her daughter, and the Irish beauty soon afterward married a fellow countryman of her own, Sir Edward Gilbert, an army captain. The couple's acquaintances being overmuch given to prattling about things best forgotten, Gilbert exchanged to a regiment in India, taking along his wife and her little girl. The child had meantime been christened Maria Dolores Eliza Rosanna, which for practical purposes was blue-penciled down to Betty. 7 years afterward Gilbert died. His widow promptly married Captain Craigie, a solid, worthy Scotch comrade-at-arms of her late husband's. Craigie generously assumed all post-Byronic responsibilities, along with the marriage vows, and at his expense Betty was sent to Scotland, later to Paris to be educated. At 16, the girl was a beauty and a witch as well. She and her mother spent a season at Bath, a resort that still retained, in those days, some shreds of its former glory. And there, among the score of younger and poorer admirers, 2 men sued for Betty's hand. One was Captain James, a likable, susceptible, not over-clever army officer, home on furlough from India. The other was a judge, very old, very gouty, very rich. And Betty's mother chose the judge, out of all the train of suitors, as her son-in-law elect. Years had taught worldly wisdom to the once gay Eliza. Betty listened in horror to the old man's mumbled vows. Then, at top speed, she fled to Captain James. She told James that her mother was seeking to sacrifice her on the altar of wealth. James, like a truly early Victorian hero, rose manfully to the occasion. He and Betty eloped, were married by a registrar, and took the next outbound ship for India. It was a day of long and slow voyages. Betty beguiled the time on shipboard by a course of behavior such as would have prevented the most charitable fellow passenger from mistaking her for a returning missionary. There were many Anglo-Indian officers and civilians aboard, and Betty's flirtations with all and sundry speedily became the scandal of the ship. By the time the vessel docked in India, there were dozens of women ready to spread abroad the bride's fame in her new homeland. English society in India was, and is, in many respects, like that of a provincial town. In the official army set, one member's business is everybody's business. Nor did Betty take any pains to erase the impressions made by her volunteer advance agents. Like a blazing star, she burst upon the horizon of India army life. Gloriously beautiful, willful, capricious, brilliant, she speedily had a horde of men at her feet, and a still larger number of women at her throat. Her flirtations were the talk of the mess room and bungalow. Heartlessly she danced on hearts. There was some subtle quality about her that drove men mad with infatuation. And her husband? He looked on in horrified wonder. Then he argued, even threatened. At last he shut up and took to drink. Betty wrote contemptuously to a friend concerning this last phase. He spends his time in drinking and then in sleeping like a gorged boa constrictor. James was liked by the English out there, and his friends fiercely resented the domestic treatment that was turning a popular and promising officer into a sodden beast. One morning James rode away over the hills and neglected to come back. His wife never heard of him again, and at his exit from the scene, the storm broke, a storm of resentment that swept Betty James out beyond even the uttermost fringe of Anglo-Indian society. She hunted up her generous old stepfather, Craigie, and induced him to give her a cheque for £1,000 to get rid of her forever. She realized another 1,000 on her votive offerings of jewelry, and with this capital she took the dust of India from her pretty slippers. Here ends Lord Ranelagh's scurrilous narrative, told at Almack's. On her way back to England, Betty broke her journey at Spain, remaining there long enough to acquire 3 valuable assets: a Spanish accent, a semi-tolerable knowledge of Spanish dancing, and the ultra-Spanish name of Lola Montez, by which, through mere courtesy to her wishes, let us hereafter call her. She burst upon the British public only to retire amid a salvo of hisses and catcalls. With the premature fall of the curtain at Her Majesty's Theatre begins the odyssey of Lola Montez. She went from London to Germany, where she danced for a time, but scant applause, at second-rate theatres, and at long last could get no more engagements. Thence she drifted to Brussels, where, according to her own later statement, she was reduced to singing in the streets to keep from starving. Contemporary malice gives a less creditable version of her means of livelihood in the Belgian capital. It was a period of her life, the black hour before the garish dawn, of which she never afterward would talk. But before long she was on the stage again, this time at Warsaw, during a revolution. She danced badly and was hissed, but the experience gave her an idea. She went straightway to Paris, where, by posing as an exiled Polish patriot, she secured an engagement at the Porte St. Martin Theatre. It was her last hope. The Polish patriot story brought a goodly crowd to Lola's first performance in Paris, but after a single dance she heard the horribly familiar sound of hisses, and at the first hiss her Irish spirit blazed into a crazy rage, a rage that was the turning point of her career. Glaring first at the spectators like an angry cat, Lola next glared around the stage for a weapon wherewith to wreak her fury upon them. But the stage was bare. Frantic, she kicked off her slippers and then tore loose her heavy buckled garters. With these intimate missiles she proceeded to pelt the grinning occupants of the front row, accompanying the volley with high-pitched, venomous Billingsgate tirade in 3 languages. That was enough. On the instant the hisses were drowned in a salvo of applause that shook the rafters. Lola Montez had arrived. Paris grabbed her to its big, childish, fickle heart. She was a spitfire, and she couldn't dance. But she had given the Parisians a genuine thrill. She was a success. 2 slippers and 2 garters, hurled with feminine rage and feminine inaccuracy into the faces of a line of bored theatre-goers, had achieved more for the fair artillerist than the most exquisite dancing could have hoped to. Lola was the talk of the hour. An army of babbling Ranelaghs could not now have dimmed her fame. Dujarrier, all-powerful editor of La Presse, laid his somewhat shop-worn heart at her feet. Dumas, Balzac, and many another celebrity sued for her favor. Her reign over the hearts of men had recommenced. But Lola Montez never rode long on prosperity's wave-crest. A French adorer, jealous of Dujarrier's prestige with the lovely dancer, challenged the great editor to a duel. Dujarrier, for love of Lola, accepted the challenge, and was borne off the field of honor with a bullet through his brain. Lola sought to improve the occasion by swathing herself somberly and right becomingly in crape, and by vowing a vendetta against the slayer. But before she could profit by the excellent advertisement, Dumas chanced to say something to a friend, who repeated it to another friend, who repeated it to all Paris, that set the superstitious mid-century Frenchman to looking askance at Lola and to avoiding her gaze. Said the Monte Cristo creator, "She has the evil eye. She will bring a curse upon any man who loves her." And by that, perhaps senseless speech, Dumas drove Lola Montez from Paris. But she took with her nil her newborn prestige as a danseuse. She took it first to Berlin. There she was bidden to dance at a court reception tendered by King Frederick William of Prussia. The rooms of the palace on the night of the reception were stiflingly hot. Lola asked for a glass of water. A much belaced and bechained chamberlain, to whom the request was repeated by a footman, sent word to Lola that she was there to dance for the king, and not to order her fellow servants around. The net result of this answer was another Irish rage. Lola, regardless of her pompous surroundings, rushed up to the offending chamberlain and loudly made known her exact opinion of him. She added that she was tired of dealing with understrappers, and that unless the king himself would bring her a glass of water, there would be no dreamy Spanish dance at the palace that night. The scandalized officials moved forward in a body to hustle the lèse-majesté perpetrator out of the sacred precincts. but the rumpus had reached the ears of King Frederick William himself at the far end of the big room. His Majesty came forward in person to learn the cause of the disturbance. He saw a marvelously beautiful woman in a marvelously abusive rage. To the monarch's amused queries, the chamberlain bleated out the awful, sacrilegious, schrecklich tale of Lola's demand. The king did not order her loaded with chains and haled to the dungeon keep. Instead, he gave a laughing order, this gracious and gentle sovereign who had so keen an eye for beauty. A moment later, a lackey brought the king a glass of water. First, gallantly touching the goblet to his own lips, His Majesty handed it with a deep obeisance to Lola. Except for the advertisement it gave her, she could gain no real advantage from this odd introduction to a king. For next day she received a secret but overwhelmingly official hint that an instant departure, not only from Berlin, but from Prussia too, would be one of the wisest moves in her whole career. She went to Bavaria and to greatness. Lola Montez, the Spanish dancer, was billed at Munich Theatre. She danced there but 3 times, for on the 3rd evening the royal box was occupied by a drowsy-eyed sexagenarian, whose uniform coat was ablaze with decorations. The old gentleman was Ludwig I, Dea Gratia, King of Bavaria, a ruler who up to this time had been beloved of his subjects, and whose worst vice, in his people's eyes, was that he encouraged art rather than arms. Ludwig watched breathlessly while Lola danced. Afterward he sent for her to come to the royal box, and she presented to him. She never danced again in Bavaria, for next day Ludwig introduced her at court as "my very good friend." Lola dazzled Munich with her jewels and her equipage. The king presented her with a huge and hideous mansion. He stretched the laws by having her declared a Bavarian subject, and having done that, he bestowed upon her the titles of Baroness von Rosenthal and Countess von Lanfeld. Next, he granted her an annuity of 20,000 florins. Things were coming Lola's way, and coming fast. The Bavarians did not dislike her at first. When Ludwig forced his queen to receive her and to pin upon the dancer emeritus's breast the order of St. Teresa, there was, to be sure, a shocked murmur, but it soon died down. Had Lola been content with her luck, she might have continued indefinitely in her new and delightfully comfortable mode of life. But according to Lola's theory, a mortal who is content with success would be content with failure, and she strove to play a greater role than the fat one assigned to her by the lovesick old king. She had read of Pompadour and other royal favorites whose vagrom whims swayed the destinies of Europe. She sought to be a world power, the power behind the throne, the woman who could mold the politics of a dynasty, and she laid her plans accordingly. It was not even a dream, this new ambition of Lola's. It was a comic opera fantasy. Bavaria, at best, was only a little German state with no special voice in the Congress of Nations, and Lola herself had no more aptitude for politics than she had for dancing. Nor did she stop to consider that Germans in 1846 were much more likely to tolerate a fair foreigner's meddling with their puppet king's domestic affairs than with matters of public welfare. But Lola Montez ever did the bulk of her sane thinking when it was too late. So she proceeded to put her idiotic plan into operation. First, she cajoled King Ludwig into dismissing a body of his perfectly capable and well-liked ministry. As delighted with that success as is the village cut-up when he pulls a chair from under the portly constable, and with even less wholesome fear of the result to herself, Lola next persuaded the king to change his whole policy of state. Then things began to happen. One morning Lola awoke in her ugly and costly mansion to find the street in front of the door blocked by a highly unfriendly mob whose immediate ambition seemed to be the destruction of the house and herself. This was the signal for one more Irish rage, the last on public record. Lola, throwing a wrapper over her nightgown, snatched up a loaded pistol, and pushing aside her screaming servants, ran out on the front steps. At sight of her, the crowd roared in fury and made a dash for the steps. Lola retaliated by emptying her revolver into the advancing mob. Events had moved rapidly since the primitive days when she was content to bombard her detractors with slippers and garter belts. The rioters halted before the fusillade. Before they could combine for another rush, and while Lola from the topmost step was reviling them in her best and fiercest German, a company of the royal bodyguard, headed by the old king himself, charged through the crowd and rescued the angry woman. But though Ludwig had just saved her from a sudden and extremely unpleasant form of death, he was not strong enough to stem the avalanche of public opinion that crashed down upon her. The same avalanche proceeded to brush Lola out of her big and hideous house, knock away from her her titles of Baroness and Countess, and her 20,000 florin annuity, and to whirl her across the Bavarian frontier with stern instructions never to return. Incidentally, poor old King Ludwig came in for so much unpopularity on her account that he was forced to abdicate. Thus, in her own fall from power, Lola had also dragged a once popular king off his throne, a noteworthy achievement in that pre-Gabe Deslys period for an Irish girl with a variegated past. The Ludwig scandal preceded Lola wherever she tried to go. The divinity that hedges a king was everywhere on guard against her. The gate to practically every country in Europe was slammed in her face. Folk fell to repeating Dumas' evil eye words, and to applying them to the discrowned old Ludwig. Lola Montez was not wanted anywhere. Certainly nowhere east of the Atlantic. So she came to New York. Here there were no kings to bar her out, lest they share Ludwig's fate. And Americans knew little and cared less about the evil eye. If Lola Montez could make it good on stage, America was willing to welcome. If not, it had no further general interest in her. Moreover, she was well past 30, at an age when the first glory of a woman's siren charms may reasonably be supposed to be slightly blurred. New Yorkers were curious to see her, on account of her history, but that was their only interest in her. She danced at the old Broadway theater. People thronged the theater for the first few performances. Then, having gazed their fill on the Bavarian throne's wrecker, and finding she could not dance, they stayed away, and Lola ended her engagement at Broadway to a hackneyed, beggarly array of empty benches. An enterprising manager, P.T. Barnum, if I remember aright, raked up the Byron story and starred Lola in a dramatization of Lord Byron's poem Mazeppa. But people had already looked at her, and the production was a failure. Next, she appeared in one or two miserably written plays based upon her own European adventures. These too failed. She then wrote a beauty book that had a small sale, and wrote also a drearily stupid volume of humor, designed as a mock guide to courtship. On her way to America, Lola had stopped in England long enough to captivate and marry a British Army officer, Heald by name. But she soon left him, and arrived in this country without visible matrimonial ties. New York having tired of her, Lola went west. She created a brief but lively furor among the gold boom towns along the Pacific coast, not so much by reason of her story as for the wondrous charm that was still hers. She gave lectures in California, and then made an Australian tour. Coming back from the Antipodes, she settled for a time in San Francisco. There, in rather quick succession, she married twice. One of her two California spouses was Hull, the famous pioneer newspaper owner of San Francisco. But she quickly wearied of the West and of her successive husbands. Back she came to New York, and to the wonder of all, and the incredulity of most, she there announced that though she had been a great sinner, she was now prepared to devote the rest of her life to penance. Strangely enough, her new resolve was not opposed. Even in her heyday, she had given lavishly to charity. Now she took up rescue work among women. She did much good in a quiet way, spending what money she had on the betterment of her sex's unfortunates, and toiling night and day in their behalf. Under this unaccustomed mode of life, Lola's health went to pieces. She was sent to a sanatorium in Astoria, Long Island, and there, in poverty and half forgotten, she died. Kindly neighbors scraped together enough money to bury her. Thus ended, in wretched anticlimax, the meteor career of Lola Montez, Wonder Woman and Wanderer, overthrower of a dynasty, and worse than mediocre dancer. Someone has called her the last of the great adventuresses, and that perhaps is her best epitaph. Her neglected grave in Greenwood Cemetery, in Brooklyn, by the way, bears no epitaph at all. That last resting place of a very tired woman is marked merely by a plain headstone whose dimmed lettering reads, Mrs. Eliza Gilbert, died June 16, 1861, age 42. One trembles to think of the near royal Irish rage that would have possessed Lola if at her Baroness, Countess, Bavarian zenith she could have foreseen that dreary little postscript to her lurid life missive. End of chapter 1.
Chapter 2 of Superwomen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Superwomen by Albert Payson Terhune. Chapter 2. Ninon de l'Enclos, Premier Siren of 2 Centuries. This story opens with the account of a deathbed scene, somewhat different from any other you may have read. It is brought in to throw a light on what heredity and careful instruction can do in molding a young mind, but don't necessarily skip it for that reason. One day, in 1630, the Sieur de l'Enclos lay dying in his great dreary bedroom in his great dreary Touraine castle. There was no especial tragedy about the closing of his life. He was elderly, very rich, and possessed of a record for having used to the full every minute of a long and exciting life. Beside his bed stood a 15-year-old girl, his only daughter, Anne, affectionately nicknamed by him, and later by all Europe, and still later by all history, Ninon. She was something below medium height, plump, with a peach-blow complexion, huge dark eyes, and a crown of red gold hair. Ninon and her father had been chums, kindred spirits from the girl's babyhood. The dying noble opened his eyes. They rested lovingly on the daughter who had bent down to hear the whispered sounds his white lips were striving to frame. Then, with a mighty effort, de l'Enclos breathed his solemn last words of counsel to the girl. Counsel intended to guide her through the future that he knew must lie before so rich and so beautiful a damsel. This was his message to her. Ninon, little girl of mine, in dying I have but one single regret. I regret that I did not get more fun out of life. I warn you, daughter, do not make the terrible mistake that I have made. Live. Live so that at the last you will not have the same cause for sorrow. So saying, the Sieur de l'Enclos bade an exemplary farewell to earth and to its lost opportunities of fun. To judge from his career as well as from his last words, one may venture the optimistic belief that he had not thrown away as many such priceless chances as he had led his daughter to believe. Ninon, then, at 15, was left alone in the world, and her actions in this sad state conformed to those of the customary helpless orphan, about as closely as had her father's death speech to the customary last words. With a shrewdness miraculous in so young a girl, she juggled her Touraine property in a series of deals that resulted in its sale at a little more than double its actual value. Rich beyond all fear of want, she settled in Paris. It was not there or then that her love life set in. That had begun long before. As a mere child she had flashed upon her little world of Touraine as a wonder girl. The superwoman charm was hers from the first, and she retained it in all its mysterious power through the 17th century and into the 18th, men vying for her love when she was 90. A full year before her father died, she had met the youthful Prince de Marsillac, and had, at a glance, wholly captivated his semi-royal fancy. It was Ninon's first love affair, with a prince. She was dazzled by it just a little, she whom monarchs later could not dazzle. She was only 14, and in Touraine a princely admirer was a novelty. At Marsillac's boyish supplication, Ninon consented to elope with him. Off they started, and back to their respective homes they were brought in dire disgrace. There was all sorts of a scandal in the neighborhood. The princeling was soundly spanked and packed off to school. The Sieur de l'Enclos came in for grave popular disapproval by laughingly refusing to mete out the same stern penalties to Ninon. To Paris, then, at 16, went the orphaned Ninon. Laughing at convention and at the threats of her shocked relatives, she set up housekeeping on her own account, managing the affairs of her Rive Gauche mansion with the ease of a 50-year-old grande dame. On Paris burst the new star. In a month the city was crazy over her. Not her beauty alone, nor her wit, nor her peculiar elegance, nor her incredibly high spirits. Not any or all of these, but an all-compelling magnetism drew men to her in shoals and swarms. By reason of her birth and breeding, she took at once her place in the court society of the day. Before she was 20, she was setting the fashions for feminine Paris, and was receiving in her salon the stateliest ladies of the court, in equal numbers with their far less stately husbands. Frankly, she declared herself a votary, not of love, but of loves. For constancy she had no use whatever. One admirer, who had won a temporary lease of her gay heart, swore he would kill himself unless Ninon would swear to love him to eternity. And, as she loved him ardently, she made the rash vow. When, at the end of 90 days, she gave him his dismissal, he reproached her wildly and bitterly for her broken pledge. "You swore you would love me to eternity," he raged, "and now—" "And now," she explained, as one might soothe a cranky child, "I have kept my vow. I have loved you for 3 endless months. That is an eternity for love." And 3 months remained to the end Ninon's record for fidelity to any one man, which was perhaps as well, for the waiting list was as long as that of a hyper-fashionable club. And now we come to a story that I do not ask you to believe, although all France unquestionably and unquestioningly believed it. Whether Ninon herself at first coined it as a joke, or whether it was a hoax that she herself credited, it is certain that she grew at last to have firm faith in it. One night, so Ninon always declared, when she was about 20, she returned home late from a ball at the Hotel St. Evremond. As she stood before the mirror of her boudoir, after her maid had left her for the night, she became aware of a shadowy reflection behind her. Turning, she saw a man clad all in black, his face hidden by the low brim of his hat and by his cloak's folds. What little was visible of his countenance was ghastly pale. Ninon, ever fearless, did not cry out for help. Instead, she approached the black-shrouded stranger, and demanded to know his business and how he had penetrated to her close-barred room. The man in black, by way of answer, drew one sable-gloved hand from beneath his cloak. In his fingers he grasped a large phial, wherein sparkled and glowed a strange, pinkish liquid. "Life is short," said the visitor, as Ninon still looked in amazing inquiry from his half-hidden face to the rose-colored phial he carried. "Life is short, but youth is far shorter. When youth is gone, love is gone. Love is the goal of life. Without youth there is no love. Without love, life is a desert. The gifts of youth and beauty are yours. Would you make them long-lasting instead of transient blessings that shall too soon become mere memories? As Ninon, dumb with wonder, hesitated to reply, he continued, "The admiration of men melts like summer snow at the first touch of age in a woman. Their admiration is now yours. Would you hold it? One drop a day from this phial, in your bath, will keep you young, will keep you beautiful, will retain for you the love of men." He set the flask on her dressing table and turned to go. "You will see me again," he said, very slowly and distinctly, "just 3 days before your death." And he vanished. To a generation that has substituted science for superstition, this tale of the man in black reads like stark nonsense. Perhaps it is. But no one in the 17th century thought so. It was an age rife with demoned legends, legends of favors granted to mortals in return for a residuary mortgage on their souls, and all that sort of thing. The tale of Faust was still almost brand new. Compared with many of the traditions that then passed for solid fact, the incident of Ninon and the man in black was almost commonplace. We laugh at such things, probably with due justification. Yet, was Ninon's adventure more inexplicable than some of the absolutely authenticated cases of Cagliostro's magic? As, for a single example, when on a certain date Cagliostro announced in Paris, "The Empress Maria Theresa of Austria died this morning." This was long before the time of telegraphy, or even of railroads. It was a journey of several days from Paris to Vienna. Dispatches, reaching the French court a week later, announced the unfortunate death of Maria Theresa at the very hour named by Cagliostro. Ninon may have invented the man in black. Or he may have been one of the many quacks who hung on the fringes of courts and made capital out of the superstitious folly of the rich. Or, perhaps. At all events, 70 years later, Ninon had either a most remarkable encounter with the same man, or else in her dying moments she took odd trouble to substantiate a silly lie that was nearly 3/4 of a century old. Finish the story, and then form your own theories. Paris was alive in those days with titled women whose antecedents were doubtful, and about whose characters there could, unluckily, be no doubt. They moved in the best society, or rather in the highest. Many of them made a living by one form or another of graft. And always there was an exclusive class of women who would not receive them. Ninon quickly proved that she had neither lot nor parcel with these titled adventuresses. From first to last she accepted not a sou, not a jewel, not a favor, political or otherwise, from the grand seigneurs who delighted to do her honor. From first to last, too, she accepted as her due the friendship of the most respectable and respected members of her own sex. She was never an adventuress, never a grafter, never a climber. She loved for love's own sake. And if the men to whom in lightning succession she gave her resilient heart chanced often to be among the foremost of the realm, it was only because the qualities that made them what they were made them also the type of man Ninon preferred. She never benefited in any material way from their adoration. The nearest approach was when Richelieu, the grim old iron cardinal, bent his ecclesiastical and consumptive body before her altar. She used her power over Richelieu freely, but never for herself, always to soften the punishment of some luckless man or woman who had fallen under the rod of his Eminence's displeasure. Thereby, and through Richelieu's love for her, Ninon clashed with no less a personage than the Queen of France herself. When Anne of Austria came from Spain to be the bride of Louis XIII of France, Richelieu fell in love with the pretty young queen. Anne had not wit enough to appreciate the cardinal's genius, or to fear his possible hate. So, Seeing in him only a homely and emaciated little man, whose pretensions she considered laughable, the Queen hit on a scheme of ridding herself forever of Richelieu's love sighs. She pretended to listen to his courtship, then told him coyly that his austerity and lack of human weakness and of humour made her afraid of him. The enamoured Richelieu insisted that he could be as human and as fun-loving as any other man. Anne bade him prove it by dressing as a circus clown and dancing a saraband for her. She said she would hide behind the curtains of a room in the palace and watch him do it. Then, were she convinced that he could really unbend, and could she overcome her fear of his lofty dignity, she would come forth and tell him so. The all-powerful Richelieu, the man of blood, whom even the haughtiest nobles feared, so far lost every remnant of sanity as to do as the Queen bade him. As a harlequin, he capered and leaped about the empty room, his eyes ever on the curtain at its far end. Suddenly, in the midst of his idiotic performance, the curtain was dashed aside, a howl of laughter swept the room, and the Queen stood revealed to his gaze. Clustered around her, and reeling with mirth, were a score of courtiers, men and women both. From that day, Richelieu was Anne's sworn foe. He wrecked her repute with the king, and for a long time managed to have her kept prisoner in the palace. In 1,000 ways he made her life a torment. And now, through the grim cardinal's love for Ninon de l'Enclos, Anne thought she saw a way of striking back at her enemy. She sent for Ninon, chided her for her mode of living, and ended by ordering her sharply to retire at once to a convent. Ninon simply smiled at the command, curtsied to the Queen, and said demurely, "I will gladly go to any convent your Majesty may designate, just as soon as I become as unattractive to men as is the woman who wants to send me there." She left the royal presence, and so great was the power of the girl's beauty in the hearts of those in France's high places, Anne did not dare put her command into effect. The tale of the conversation spread like the prehistorically bromidic wildfire, and Ninon won new laurels thereby. The Duke of St. Evremond, at that time one of the greatest men in Europe, offered her his heart and his princely fortune. She replied that his heart was a precious gift, which she would prize forever, or for a month or two at the very least, but that she had no use whatever for his fortune, as she had all the money she needed, and more would only be a burden. And the Duke, veteran of many a love affair where fortunes had counted for far more than hearts, made the quaint, historic reply, "Mademoiselle, tu es un honnête homme." Mademoiselle, you are an honest man. 3 generations of Sévignes, father, son, and grandson, in turn loved Ninon during her 75 years of heartbreaking. Love for her seemed a hereditary trait in the Sévigné family. But it was the old Duke of St. Evremond, of all her numberless wooers, for whom Ninon cared most. Though their love was soon dead, they remained loyal and devoted friends to the day of the Duke's death. Their correspondence, prettily formal, yet with an undercurrent of true affection, is still extant. And through life Ninon ran always to the Duke with every sorrow or perplexity. Notably, when at the age of 60 she discovered her first wrinkle, an all but invisible crease between her brows. In horror she related to St. Evremond the fearful tragedy. With a laugh he banished her dread. "That is no wrinkle, ma petite," he reassured her. "Love placed it there to nestle in." The mighty Prince de Conde, the left-handedly royal d'Estrées, La Rochefoucauld, the Machiavelli of France, and many other of like rank and attainment, were proud to count themselves Ninon's worshippers. To no one did she show more favour than to another. King of France or Scarron, the humpback poet, so long as they could amuse her, Ninon gave no thought to their titles or wealth or name. To her, One was as good as another. To none did she give fidelity. Nearly all of them she treated outrageously. Yet of them all, only one was ever driven away by her caprices before she was fully ready to dismiss him. That sole exception was the gallant Comte de Fiesque, who, for a brief space of time, held her wandering heart and thoughts. Ninon, as a rule, was not quarrelsome, but she and de Fiesque were as flint and steel. Their affair was one fierce series of spats and disputes that blazed out at last in a pyrotechnic row. As a result of this climax quarrel, de Fiesque scuttled away in red wrath, vowing that he was for ever and ever done with so ill-tempered and cranky a woman as Ninon de l'Enclos. Ninon was aghast. Paris was aghast. France was aghast. The love world at large was aghast. For the first time in her whole hectic life, Ninon de l'Enclos had been deserted, actually deserted, and by a nobody like de Fiesque. She who had snubbed a king, had tired of Condé, had yawned daintily in the half-monarchical face of d'Estrées himself. It was unbelievable. For an instant, her fame as a peerless and all-conquering Wonder Woman threatened to go into partial eclipse. But only for an instant. De Fiesque, placed during a little hour on a pinnacle of flaring originality, began to receive tenderly reproachful letters from Ninon, beseeching him to come back to her, saying she had been wrong in their dispute, begging his forgiveness. Ninon, to whom princes had knelt trembling, promising all sorts of meek, womanly behavior, if only he would cure her heartbreak by a word of love. These letters of hers to her deserter would have moved an equestrian statue to maudlin tears. But de Fiesque's pride had been too deeply cut by that last quarrel to let him relent. Besides, he was vastly enjoying his novel position as the only man on earth to whom Ninon de l'Enclos had made such an appeal. So, while his fellow courtiers alternately envied him and longed to kick him, they wondered what might be the secret of his fascination over Ninon. Thus, for a few days, matters stood. Then Ninon hit on a master stroke. The thing that had first attracted de Fiesque to her had been the glory of her red gold hair. He had loved to bury his face in its shimmering soft masses, to run its silk strands through his fingers. Incidentally, in the course of their epoch-marking quarrel, he had called Ninon supremely vain and selfish. Now she cut off all her wonderful hair, cut it off, wrapped it up, and sent it, without a word of explanation, to de Fiesque. He understood. She had made this supreme sacrifice for him, for the man who had deserted her. To him she was offering this chief beauty of hers. De Fiesque's pride vanished. Through the streets he ran, bareheaded, to Ninon's house. Into her presence he dashed and flung himself at her feet, imploring forgiveness for his brutality, and vowing that he loved her alone in all the world. But the rest of the dialogue did not at all work out along any recognized lines of lovers' reconciliations. Ninon patiently heard to an end de Fiesque's blubbered protestations of devotion. Then, very calmly and triumphantly, she pointed to the door. The interview was over. So was the affair. Ninon de l'Enclos was vindicated. No lover had ever permanently deserted her. There was no man so stubborn that she could not lure him back to her. The de Fiesque incident was closed. All that remained for Ninon to do was to introduce among Paris women a temporary fashion of wearing the hair short, which she promptly did. And thus she suffered not at all by her ruse. Some 2 centuries later, George Sand, who had read of the incident, tried the same trick to win back Alfred de Musset. In her case, it was a right dismal failure. De Musset, too, was entirely cognizant of the story of Ninon's short hair, and even without her hair Ninon was lovely, while even with hers George Sand was hideous. Queen Christina of Sweden came to France. Ninon delighted the eccentric Swede. Christina made a confidant and familiar friend of her. She begged Ninon to return with her to Sweden, promising her a title and estates and a high place at court. Ninon called unexpectedly at Christina's Paris apartments one morning to talk over the plan. She entered the Queen's drawing room unannounced. There, on the floor, lay a man, one of the Swedish officials in Christina's suite. He was dead, murdered, and was lying as he had fallen when he had been stricken down. Above him stood Christina, at her side the assassin who had struck the blow. The Queen turned to Ninon and explained. The official had displeased Her Majesty by some undiplomatic act, and taking justice into her own hands, Christina had ordered another member of her suite to murder the offender. She was as unconcerned over the killing as if she had ordered a rabid dog to be shot. Ninon fled in panic fear from the apartment. Nor ever again could she be induced to come into the presence of the loyal murderess. Thus ended the Swedish project. Though the confidential friendship of one queen was thus taken forcibly from Ninon, she had later the satisfaction of helping on the cause of another and uncrowned queen. It is her one recorded experience in dabbling with politics, and the role she played therein is interesting. King Louis XIV, son of that Anne of Austria who had hated Ninon, had reached the age when life began at times to drag. The Grand Monarch had still fewer reasons than those of Ninon's father to deplore the missing of any good times. But youth had fled from him at last. He found himself, in middle age, a sour-faced, undersized man, with a huge periwig, a huger out-jutting beak of a nose, and wearing egregiously high boots to eke out his height. People, a very few of them, and at a safe distance, were beginning to laugh at his pretensions as a lady-killer. Nature, too, was proving herself less a tender mother than a Gorgon-like stepmother by racking him with dyspepsia, bad nerves, and gout. These causes led him to turn temporarily to what he termed the higher life. In other words, by his whim, the court took to wearing somber garments, changing its scandalous conversation for pious reflection, and its unprintable novels for works on philosophy, whereat yawns of boredom assailed high heaven. In the course of his brief penitence, Louis frowned majestically upon his tempest-tempered favourite, Madame de Montespan, and she, tactless or oversure of her position, scowled back, harshly derided the new order of affairs, and waxed more evil-tempered than ever. In Madame de Montespan's household was a certain Madame de Maintenon, widow of the humpbacked little Scarron, who had once sued for Ninon de l'Enclose's favour. Strangely enough, his widow and Ninon were close friends, and at this court crisis Ninon made the term friendship mean something. She herself had plainly shown that she had no interest in the king. Now she set to work to make the king feel an interest in Madame de Maintenon, whom Louis in his long period of gaiety had always disliked. Ninon taught the widow how and when to throw herself in the king's way, and how to treat him. She coached her friend as a stage director coaches a promising but raw actor. As a result, when Louis came, smarting, from a squabble with the fiery de Montespan, he would find himself, by merest chance, in the presence of de Maintenon, whose grave gentleness and attitude of awed devotion served as balm to his quarrel-jarred nerves. He took to seeking out the wise and gentle widow, of his own accord, as he thought, and spending more and more time in her company. And de Maintenon, carefully coached by Ninon, the Queen of Hearts' students, managed to waken in the deadened royal brain a flicker of admiration that slowly warmed into love. At that point Ninon's genius achieved its most brilliant stroke. Under her instructions, the widow gave the king's advances just the right sort of treatment. She made it clear to Louis that she scorned to be a royal favorite. As a result, one midnight, there was a secret wedding in the palace chapel, King Louis XIV becoming the legal, if unacknowledged, husband of the penniless humpback's meek widow, Ninon, it is said, being one of the ceremony's few witnesses. Ninon had played politics just once, and with far-reaching results to history, as de Maintenon's future influence over her husband was to prove. Among the results, the revocation of the Edict of Nantes is laid at de Maintenon's door, an act that partly depopulated France and partly populated America. By this time, Ninon had become something more than a winner of hearts and a setter of fashions. She found herself a social arbiter as well. Without an introduction to the illustrious Ninon de l'Enclos and a word of endorsement from her, no young man could hope to make his way into Paris society. Noblemen in the country, sending their sons to Paris for a career, moved heaven and earth to obtain for them letters of introduction to Ninon. Her lightest expression of opinion was everywhere quoted as inspired. With a smile or a frown, she could make or unmake men's futures at court. Had she so chosen, she might have become, with this amazing amount of power, a most unbearable tyrant. Instead, she used her power wisely and kindly. Charitable to a fault, her tact and her money and her boundless influence were always making the way easy for someone or another. For instance, in her old age, or rather in what would have passed for old age in any other woman, she took an interest in a wizened, monkey-like boy of the people. She set him on the path to advancement and supplied him with the money for his education. To his dying day the little man remembered her with a veneration most people would have bestowed on a saint, even though he used the education she had given him to help in tearing down the monarchy whose nobles had been his benefactress's slaves. He is known to fame as Voltaire. Years came and went. They merged into decades and quarter centuries. The men who once had loved Ninon de l'Enclos grew old and tired, and their places were taken by sons, and then by grandsons. Dynasties changed. The world rolled on. New times brought new customs. But Ninon remained unchanged. Still beautiful, still vibrant, with all her early gay charm, she remained to outward appearances what she had been for the past 50 years. The grandsons of her girlhood suitors were as madly in love with her as had been their grandsires. In love, in society, in fashion, she was still the unquestioned sovereign. Throughout Europe there was now no one who doubted the unadorned truth of the story concerning the man in black, for it seemed that no mortal agency could have kept any woman so perennially young. As the years passed, folk fell to speculating on how many drops of the precious rose-colored liquid might still remain in the phial, and in scared voices they repeated the prophecy of the man in black: "You shall see me once again 3 days before your death." Perhaps, now that you know Ninon better, you may laugh less contemptuously at the tale of the man in black, or at the least credit her with believing it. Throughout her life she never changed the story in any way, nor could the shrewdest cross-examining lead her to contradict herself about any of its most minute details. A haunting fear of the man in black's promised return was always in her mind, even during her gayest days and nights. As late as her 90th year men made vehement love to her. At an age when most women are withered crones, she still broke hearts. Men fought duels by the dozen for her favor. In her old age, a youth blew out his brains on her account. During her later years, a great sorrow came to her. Through no conscious fault of her own, she was enmeshed in what was probably the most horrible tragedy of its sort in history. This tragedy cannot even be touched on here. In no book written in the English language can you find its complete details. It is enough to say that the nameless horror of it wrecked Ninon's health and her mind, leaving her for the time a mental and physical wreck. Slowly she recovered her health, her brain, and her unquenchable spirits. Her beauty had never been impaired. And once more she ruled as Queen of Hearts. Now, too, she blossomed forth into literature, becoming with ease a famous author. Her essays were quoted, imitated, lauded to the skies. Nor is there the slightest reason to doubt that she was their author. Always bluntly honest to a fault, the woman who would not accept rank or money was not likely to accept the literary ideas of others and pass them off as her own. Also, the style of her published work was identical with her private letters. It is odd and possibly, or possibly not, significant that of the world's superwomen, more have leaned towards literature than toward any other one pursuit. The gift of writing comes nearer to being their one common trait than do beauty and all the other hackneyed siren charms. The power that enables such women to win hearts appears to manifest itself by use of the pen. To instance, a very few of the hundreds of heartbreakers who were also authors, letter writers, and so forth of greater or less note, one has but to recall George Sand, Ada Menken, Adrienne Lecouvreur, Ninon de l'Enclos, Lola Montez, Madame de Sévigné, Madame Récamier, Madame Roland, and Marie Stuart. By 1706 there was scarce a man or woman left alive who remembered Ninon when, as a girl, she had come first to Paris. Youths who had worshipped her as a middle-aged woman were now aged men. She herself was 90. To say that she was still a girl in her looks and actions is a gross exaggeration, of course. Not the firmest believers in the man in black claimed that. But at 90 she was still beautiful, still alluring and adorable as men continued to learn. Younger women, women young enough to be her grandchildren, were neglected for her sake. It is said that on her 90th birthday she received a fervent declaration of love from a noble who had met her but a few days earlier. Then came the end. On one day in 1706, Ninon de l'Enclos was in blooming health. On the next, she was dying. She wrote a single line to one of her friends and dispatched it by a messenger. The letter did not find the woman to whom it was addressed until nearly a week later. 3 days from the time she wrote it, Ninon died. The friend, opening the letter, read, scrawled in a fear-shaken hand, this sentence: "I have just seen the man in black again." End of chapter 2. Chapter 3 of Superwomen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Superwomen by Albert Payson Terhune. Chapter 3. Peg Woffington, Irish Heart Conjurer. A throng of people, barefoot peasants, modish idlers, tradesfolk, riffraff, stood in a Dublin courtyard one day in 1727, providing the much-admired sea of upturned faces. All eyes were raised, all necks were back-bent. Everyone was looking aloft to where a taut wire was stretched between two post-tops. Along the wire walked a harlequin, taking mincing dance steps and balancing across his shoulders a pole from whose extremities dangled 2 huge baskets. To make the feat more interesting by adding a spice of possible peril, announcement had been made that each basket contained a live child. The chance of a triple tragedy in the event of a misstep made the type wire walk a right diverting spectacle, and thrilling withal to the good folk of Dublin. But halfway between the 2 extremity posts, still a new element of interest was added. For, at that point, the top suddenly popped off one of the baskets, and a big-eyed, laughing face beamed down over the edge at the crowd. The face of a 7-year-old child, a girl. A roar of applause followed upon the youngster's unrehearsed appearance. Thus did Peg Woffington, a queen of her century's actresses and consummate heart conjurer, make her professional debut. Peg, her full first name, which nobody dreamed of using, was Margaret, was the daughter of an Irish bricklayer, who had one point in common with certain modernists in that he was rabidly opposed to all doctors. And the medical guild had in due time its revenge on the sacrilegious brick artist. For once, when Woffington fell ill, he fiercely refused to have a physician summoned, and he rapidly grew better. As her husband was convalescing, Mrs. Woffington sought to make assurance doubly certain by calling in a doctor. The pill juggler looked at the invalid and pronounced him out of danger. Next day, Woffington died. Peg was just learning to walk at the time of her lamented father's tilt with the cult of Aesculapius. She and her baby sister, Mary, at once set about helping to earn their own living by toddling on either side of their mother when the widow hawked watercress through the streets, and shrilly piping in duet the virtues of her wares. To Dublin, when Peg was 7, came one Madame Violante, with a troupe of tumblers and rope dancers. Peg was apprenticed to Madame Violante. But her term of service as a baby acrobat was short. Her employer had better use for her. It was Madame Violante who originated the ever-since popular custom of producing famous plays and operas with child actors filling all the roles. Her Lilliputian troupe scored a big success in Dublin and the provinces. Much of this success was due to Peg, who almost invariably was cast for old woman parts, and who doubled in the brass by doing quaint little step dances between the acts. It was cruelly hard work for a growing child, nor was the early 18th century theater the very best sort of nursery and moral training school for little girls. But apart from other and less creditable lessons acquired, she learned stage presence and practically every art and trick of the profession. From the Lilliputian troupe, Peg graduated into the more lucrative and equally moral pursuit of theater orange vendor. In slack seasons, when no cargo of oranges chanced to have landed recently from the Americans, she acted off and on, playing at 12 mature roles in provincial theater comedies, and exhibiting a rollicking humor that carried her audiences by assault. At 17, she was playing, at $7.50 a week, Ophelia and other exacting parts. Incidentally, on both sides of the footlight candles, as actress and as orange girl in the pit, she had long since made herself the toast of Dublin beaux. She was pretty, though not strikingly so. She had a ready and occasionally flaying Irish wit. She had, too, the magic, if still undeveloped, fascination of the Superwoman. As to her morals, they were the morals of any and every other girl of her environment and upbringing. She was quite as good as she knew how to be. There was not a grain of real vice in her whole cosmos. But there was a blazing ambition, an ambition that was cramped and choked in the miserable makeshift provincial playhouses. She burned to be a famous actress. There was no chance for her in Ireland, so she came to London. It was a case of burning her bridges behind her, for she carried a worn purse that held 17 shillings, and the not over-new dress she wore was her sole wardrobe. These were her tangible assets. On this capital, and on genius and pluck and ambition and good looks, and the charm that was daily growing more and more irresistible, Peg relied to keep her going. To manager after manager she trudged. Not one would find work for her. In all, she made 19 applications, and she scored just precisely 19 rank failures. Finally, half-starved and wholly discouraged, she succeeded in interesting the manager of the Covent Garden Theatre, and he gave her, or sold her, the chance she sought, the chance to appear before a London audience. Her first appearance on the metropolitan stage was all that was needed to prove her worth. At once she caught the public fancy. Soon she found herself the most popular actress in England. An air of mingled sadness and gaiety in her stage work, an audacity and fresh youthfulness, and the mystic charm, carried her straight to the front. At this period she touched nothing but comedy, at which she had no peer, and preferably played male roles. Masculine attire set forth her stunning figure, and she played devil-may-care, boyish parts as could no other woman. One night, after the first act of The Constant Couple, wherein, clad in small clothes and hose, she was playing Sir Harry Wildair, Peg ran laughing and triumphant into the green room. There she chanced to find her bitterest friend and rival, Mistress Kitty Clive, a clever but somewhat homely actress. Said Peg in delight, "They applauded me to the echoes. Faith, I believe half the men in the house thought I really was a boy." "Perhaps," sneered envious Kitty, "but it is certain that at least half of them knew you weren't." Peg stopped short in her gay laugh, and eyed Kitty's plain visage quizzically. "Mistress Clive," observed Peg, in irrelevant reflection, "did you ever stop to wonder how much utterly useless modesty an ugly woman is responsible for unloading upon this poor world of ours?" Kitty did not again cross swords with Peg. Indeed, after the first encounter, few people did. The fops, the wits, the macaronis, the bloods, the Corinthians, all had discovered Peg long before this time. She was their darling, their idol. As this poor article is too brief in scope to contain a transcript of London's social and club register of the day, most of Peg's minor conquests must be passed over without a word. One or two alone stand out as worth a few sentences. Macklin, matinee favorite and really great actor, fell head over heels in love with her. So did Hallam, the doctor author. Macklin, having no hope of winning Peg's favor, was content to watch over her and to guard her like a faithful bulldog. Hallam was not so humble. Peg did not share her father's hatred for doctors, for she flirted lazily with Hallam and amused herself with his admiration. In time she tired of him and frankly told him so. Hallam, lacking the game, sought the name. Furious at his dismissal, he was still eager to be considered a successful wooer of the famous actress. So he took to boasting loudly at White's and the Cocoa Tree that Peg cared for him alone, and that she had written him reams of burningly ardent love letters. Peg heard of the boast, and was foolish enough to run to the devoted Macklin with the story, entreating him to punish the braggart. Macklin did not wait to write a challenge, or even go home for his sword, which he did not happen to be wearing that day. Snatching up his cane, he rushed to a nearby coffee-house, where he knew Hallam was likely to be found at that hour. There he discovered the author-doctor drinking with a circle of friends, to whom he was descanting upon Peg's worship of himself. Macklin sprang at Hallam, seized him by the throat, and caned him unmercifully. Hallam writhed free and whipped out his sword. Macklin, forgetting that he himself was wielding a cane and not a sword, parried Hallam's first thrust and lunged for the doctor's face. The ferrule of the cane pierced Hallam's left eyeball and penetrated to his brain, killing him instantly, an odd climax to one of history's oddest duels. Macklin was placed on trial for his life, but he was promptly acquitted, and Peg's renown glowed afresh because, through her, a man had died. A pamphlet, written by still another vehement admirer, contains a description of Peg Woffington, written about the time of Hallam's taking off. Part of this word picture is worth repeating verbatim. You will note that, though contemporary, it is in the past tense. Here it is. Her eyes were black as jet, and while they beamed with ineffable luster, at the same time revealed all the sentiments of fair possessor. Her eyebrows were full and arched, and had a peculiar property of inspiring love or striking terror. Her cheeks were vermilioned with nature's best rouge, and outvied all the labored works of art. Her nose was somewhat of the aquiline, and gave her a look full of majesty and dignity. Her lips were of the color of coral, and the softness of down, and her mouth displayed such beauties as would thaw the very bosom of an anchorite. Her teeth were white and even. Her hair was of a bright auburn color. Her whole form was beauteous to excess. In the heyday of her glory, Peg went to drink a dish of tea with a party of friends one afternoon. Among the guests was a slender little commercial man, a wine merchant in fact, shrewd, stingy, and smug. How much a character as his could have awakened the very faintest response in impulsive, big-hearted Peg's is one of the innumerable mysteries of hearts. But at first glance she loved the little man, loved him as never before she had loved, and as she would never love again. She had met the love of her life. She asked to have him introduced. The little vintner, tickled that the great Mistress Woffington should have deigned to notice an unknown nonentity, was duly brought up and presented. Peg, her head swimming, did not at once catch his name and bade him repeat it. Obediently the dapper youth replied, "David Garrick, madam." In the hour that ensued, Peg led Garrick to talk about himself, a never difficult task. He told her that he hated his trade, and that he was not making money thereby. Peg, appraising the man's appearance as well as a woman newly in love could hope to, saw that, though short, he was graceful and strikingly handsome. Also that he had a marvelous voice. Abruptly, she broke in on his soliloquy by suggesting that he go on the stage. Garrick stared. She spoke the glories of a star's life. Garrick yawned. She mentioned that successful actors drew large salaries. Garrick sat up and began to listen. When she went on to speak of the fabulous receipts that awaited a star, Garrick feverishly consented to her plan. Peg set to work, using to the straining point all her boundless theatrical influence. She got Garrick a chance. She coached him in the rudiments of acting. She found that the little wine seller had a heaven-sent gift for the stage. So did the managers. So, in short order, did the public. Garrick's success was as instantaneous as had been Peg's own. Peg rejoiced unspeakably in his triumph. So did he. The lofty motives that actuated Garrick's stage work may be guessed at from this entry in his diary, October 20th, 1741. Last night played Richard III to the surprise of all. I shall make nearly £300 a year as an actor, and that is what I really dote on. But he made infinitely more than the prophesied $1,500 a year, for he speedily became an actor-manager. His business training and his notorious stinginess were splendid assets. Money flowed in beyond his wildest dreams of avarice, and he held on to it all. Peg was inordinately proud of his achievements. So was Garrick. Peg loved him to distraction. He graciously consented to be loved. Indeed, it is probable that he cared for Peg as much as he could care for anybody except David Garrick. A swarm of women fell in love with him when he made his stage success. In spite of this, he still loved Peg, even if not exclusively. Then Peg and Garrick appeared for the time as co-stars, and with him she returned to the scene of her early struggles at Dublin. At the Smock Alley Theatre there, the two acted in repertoire. The pair were an enormous hit, so much so that they were forced, by popular clamor, to play straight through the summer. It was one of the hottest summers on record, but great crowds jammed the theatre at each performance. An epidemic swept Dublin. A good many of the playgoers caught the infection at the playhouse and died, which caused the epidemic to receive the sinister nickname, the Garrick fever. Peg was no less popular than was her colleague. Together they toured Ireland, then came back to London as openly avowed lovers. They were engaged to be married, but the marriage was from time to time postponed, always at Garrick's suggestion. Sir Charles Hanbury Williams, a suitor for Peg's favor at this time, was the author, among half a bookful of odes, sonnets, and so forth, to her charms, of Lovely Peggy, a popular song hit of the day, a stanza of which runs: "Once more I'll tune the vocal shell, to hills and dales my passion tell, a flame which time can never quell, that burns for lovely Peggy." Yet greater bards the lyre should hit, to say what subject is more fit than to record the sparkling wit and bloom of lovely Peggy. But Sir Charles wooed her in vain. She had thoughts for no one else but Garrick. One day, reproached by the poet with her greater regard for his rival, and not wishing to cause needless pain to the loser, Peg sought to evade the charge by saying that she had not seen Garrick for an age. "Nay," contradicted the luckless Sir Charles, "I know you saw him only yesterday." "Well," she retorted, "and is not that an age?" She and Garrick had a singular rule for maintaining their antemarital establishment. It was arranged by Garrick that each should bear the monthly expenses alternately. When it was Peg's turn, it was noticeable that much better food was provided, and that many more dinner guests were invited to the house than during the alternate months when Garrick was running the place. Once, during a Garrick month, a crowd of people dropped in unexpectedly to tea. Garrick eyed them with scarce disguised hostility. Peg was delighted to see them, but no more so than if their call had come on her month for paying the bills, for she was lavishly hospitable and was always generous, even prodigal to a fault, traits that caused her thrifty lover much pain. Today, as usual, Peg brewed the tea. Glancing at his own new-filled cup, as Macbeth might have glared at the imaginary Banquo, Garrick groaned aloud. "Peg, you've made this tea so strong it's as red as blood. Zounds, ma'am, do you think 'tis to be bought at a penny the pound that you squander it so?" It has ever been the fashion of romantic chroniclers, in writing of this strange union, to paint Peg as a suffering saint and Garrick as a crank. The latter picture is flawless, the former, unluckily, is not. For, though Peg loved the actor-manager, and, temporarily, loved no one else, yet it was not in her superwoman nature to rest meekly content with the attentions of one man, even though that man chanced to be the celebrated Davy Garrick. Running through the warp of her love was a woof of flirtations. For one instance, Lord Darnley, a rich and notorious Piccadilly gallant, proclaimed himself to be her adorer. Flattered at so famous a nobleman's love, Peg flirted outrageously with Darnley. She even denied to him that she cared for Garrick. Once, Darnley found Garrick's wig in Peg's boudoir and railed at her infidelity to himself. Peg explained that she had borrowed the actor's wig, and had brought it home in order to practice it in a masculine role she was soon to play at the Drury Lane. Garrick, in jealous wrath, protested against her affair with Darnley. So she swore to Garrick that she had dismissed his rival, and gaily continued to meet Darnley on the sly. In time, Garrick found her out, and the discovery led to their separation. Afterward, in remorse, Peg is said to have dropped Darnley. But then, as usual, it was too late for her renunciation to do any good, except to punish herself. Time after time, Garrick had set back the date of the wedding. When at last the Darnley crisis came, Peg asked him frankly if he meant to keep his pledge or not. He replied gloomily that he did, and he went out and bought a wedding ring. He sighed in utter misery as he slipped the gold loop on her finger. Out flashed Peg's Irish temper. "If you had 10 times the wealth and repute and ability that the world credits you with," she declared, "I would not become your wife after this silent confession." Almost at once she repented her rash words of release, but Garrick held her to them. He considered himself freed, and they parted. Peg sent back all Garrick's presents. He refused to return hers. They included a pair of diamond shoe buckles she had given him, on the tender plea that they would serve him as reminders of her. Peg wrote an angry letter, pointing out very clearly the wide gulf between sentiment and graft, and telling Garrick on exactly which side of that gulf his action in regard to the presents placed him. Garrick retaliated by blackening her name on every occasion. She made no reply to any of his dirty slurs, nor spoke of him save in praise. Thus ended the great love of Peg's life. But there were a host of minor loves to help take its place. Next came Spanger Barry, a fiery Irish actor who, to revenge Peg's supposed wrongs, did his level best on the stage to crowd Garrick out of several of the latter's favorite roles. He did not wholly succeed in this loverly attempt, but he caused Garrick many an hour of uneasiness, and wounded him severely by causing a drop in the actor-manager's box-office receipts. Then came a succession. To quote a biographer who wrote while Peg's name was yet fresh, "An infatuated swain swore that if she did not return his love he would hang, drown, or shoot himself, and in order not to be responsible for his suicide, she consented to listen to his sighs. Then there came along a gentleman with money who won her affection. Another next presented and outbid the former. Another offered, and she received him in her train. A fifth appeared, and was well received. A sixth declared his suit, and his suit was not rejected. In a word, a multitude of love's votaries paid their adorations to the shrine of their fair saint, and their fair saint was not cruel. Then, according to the same chronicler, and another, came into Peg's life a personage. There is no hint as to his identity. Whether she was true to him or not is debatable, but she soon discovered that he had grown tired of her. It was borne to her ears that he was paying court to an heiress, intending to break with Peg by degrees if his suit were successful. The heiress gave a masked ball in honor of her birthday. Peg gained admittance in male costume to the affair, and contrived to become her rival's partner in a minuet. When she straightway poured so many and such vile stories anent the gentleman's character into the lady's ears that the latter fainted, and the ball broke up in confusion. But Peg had gained her aim, by hopelessly discrediting with the heiress the recreant lover. The match was broken off. Peg found herself right cozily revenged. The next wooer was a person, not a personage. He was Owen McSweeney, a buffoon. He was the premier clown of his day and a local celebrity. McSweeney was fairly well-to-do, and when he died soon afterward, it was found that he had left his whole estate, some £200 a year, to Peg. It was not long after this that Richard Brinsley Sheridan, in his early prime, engaged Peg at £400 a season to play at his theatre. Sheridan was fervid in his admiration of the Irish beauty. Perhaps this fact, as well as the marked success she scored in his plays, led The Rival's author to double her salary after the first season. Yearly, she grew more popular with her audiences. Having won a matchless reputation as a comedian, she turned for a time to tragic characters, and won thereby a wholly new renown as one of England's foremost tragedians. But comedy was her forte, and to it she returned. Peg always vowed that she hated the society of her own sex, a lucky thing for her, since she was not received by ladies of quality, as were many of her fellow actresses, and since her sharp tongue, and the fact that men went wild over her, made her hated by these fellow actresses. But her popularity with men endured, and she wasted few tears over women's dislikes. Few superwomen have been popular with their own sex. Peg was elected president of the famed Beefsteak Club, and she always presided at the board in man's attire. All this time she had been supporting her mother in a luxury undreamed of in the days of the medicophobic bricklayer, and she had educated and jealously safeguarded her younger sister, Mary. Mary became engaged to Captain George Cholmondeley, son of the Earl of Cholmondeley, a glittering match for a bricklayer's daughter. The Earl was justly indignant and posted away to Peg to break off the affair, if need be, by bribing her and the entire tribe of Woffington. Peg met the irate old fellow with the full battery of her charm. In a trice she had him bewildered, then half relenting. Feebly he tried to bluster. Peg cut him short with, "My lord, I'm the one to complain, not you, for now I'll have 2 beggars instead of 1 to feed." It was a true forecast, for the Earl, despite Peg's blandishments, withheld for a time his checkbook, and in the interim she gave the new-wed pair a house to live in and the money to run it. And now for the last big scene of Peg's stage career. For some time she had been ailing, but she kept on with her acting. On the evening of May 17th, 1757, when she was at the very acme of her career, she played Rosalind at Covent Garden. Throughout the comedy she was at her scintillant best. The house was hers. Wave after wave of frantic applause greeted her, as, still in Rosalind's male habiliments, she stepped before the curtain, flushed and smiling, to deliver the epilogue. Gaily stretching out her arms to pit and stalls, she began the familiar lines. With a gesture of infinite coquetry, she continued, "I would kiss as many of you as had beards that pleased me, complexions that liked me. She faltered, whitened under her makeup, skipped 3 full lines, and came to the tag. "When I make curtsy, bid me farewell." The last line haltingly spoken, she threw her hands high in the air and screamed in a voice of abject terror, "Oh God! Oh God!" It was a prayer, not an oath. Reeling, the actress staggered to the wings and there fell, swooning, leaving the packed house behind her in an uproar of confusion. Kindly arms bore her from the stage she was never more to tread. Next day, all London knew that Mistress Peg Woffington had been stricken with paralysis, and that from the neck down she was dead. Only the keen-witted brain lived, to realize the wreck of the beautiful body. Sorrowing crowds blocked the street in front of her house for days, momentarily expecting news of her death. But Peg did not die. She did not die until 3 tedious years had passed. Little by little, she partly regained the use of her body. But she was feeble. Her rich beauty had wiped out as an acid-soaked sponge might efface a portrait. Out of the gay life that had been the breath of her nostrils, feeble as an old woman, plain of face and halting of speech, she nevertheless retained enough of the wondrous ancient charm to enslave another adorer. The newest and last wooer was Colonel Caesar of the Guards. On learning that Peg, in her stricken state, had infatuated the gallant colonel, a coffee-house wit sized up the situation by cruelly quoting, "Aut Caesar, aut nullus." It was a vile thing to say. And Caesar hunted up the humorist, so runs the story, and thrashed him within an inch of his life. Some time later, Tate Wilkinson, an impersonator of that era, yes, there were pests on the earth even in those days, was scheduled to give a series of humorous impersonations of famous actors and actresses at Drury Lane, then managed and partly owned by David Garrick. Peg feared she might be held up to ridicule by the mimicry. The fear preyed on her mind to a pathetic extent. Colonel Caesar went to the theater and there informed Garrick that if he permitted Wilkinson to impersonate Mistress Woffington, the colonel would first give him a public caning, and would then call him out. The impersonation of Peg had been mysteriously lost from the imitator's repertoire when the performance was given. Peg died in 1760, at the age of 40. She left more than £5,000. She left it to charity. And, as a testimonial to her, a range of low-roofed, wisteria-covered cottages was built for the exclusive use of the poor. The dwellings were known as the Margaret Woffington Cottages. Samson's costume would start a panic on modern Broadway, yet it was doubtless deemed correct in his time. Queen Elizabeth's table manners would cause her speedy ejectment from any civilized restaurant, yet she was 16th century's model for etiquette. George Washington's spelling would not pass muster in a primary school, though in 1776 he was regarded as a man of high education, while as for Lady Godiva... New times, new ways. Won't you remember that in dealing with Peg Woffington? She was a product, and a fine product, of her generation and surroundings. Think of her only as an unfortunate, warm-hearted, beautiful girl, whom men adored almost as much for her lovable qualities as for her siren fascinations. She merits a pedestal in the temple of Superwomen. If I have failed to establish her right to do it, the fault is mine, not hers. End of chapter 3.